Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see folks are still coming into the room, but we'll get started here. So, welcome to today's webinar, Living by the Rules, Busting Legal Myths About Law and Culture in Canada. My name is Jessica Steingard,
And I'm Judy Feng.
and we're both staff lawyers here at the Centre for Public Legal Education Alberta, or CPLEA for short. We also have Jessica, our artist and designer from our team, is in the background. She'll be putting up some links in the chat and highlighting some exhibits throughout the webinar. So watch for some good links to come up in the chat. A little bit about CPLEA. We are a nonprofit organization that serves all of Alberta. And our goal is quite simple sounding, I guess, and that is to make the law understandable for Alberta, which can be a daunting task at times. So we provide legal information and education through our various booklets, tip sheets, videos, webinars, like this one. We also run several websites and more. Before we start, we'd like to thank our funders. We have the Alberta Law Foundation, the Department of Justice Canada, and the Alberta Real Estate Foundation for making initiatives like this one possible. We also respectfully acknowledge that we are located across Treaty 4, 6, 7, 8, and 10 territories, and we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continue to enrich our communities. And one more disclaimer, our webinars contain legal information only and not legal advice. So at CPLEA, we often see the same legal myths come up over and over again, whether they're online or through questions from the public, or even with some of the legal intermediaries that we work with. And they're often well-intentioned. They may even sound very logical, and sometimes they're even rooted in pulp culture or American law. But they're probably still wrong, and sometimes they leave us shaking our heads.
And if you've ever thought, well, that can't possibly be how the law actually works, you're probably right. And if you've ever thought, oh, I heard this from a friend, a family member, or the internet, I don't know if it sounds right. Well, then you're definitely not alone. So today we're putting those myths under the microscope, putting them in focus and dissecting them with our legal lens. So Jessica's going to pull up an audience poll here. We're going to start off with a quick poll. So what's your go-to legal information source? Where are your perceptions of our legal culture perhaps coming from? So you could check all that apply. Perhaps you get your legal information from legal supports. For example, maybe a lawyer, a free legal clinic. You go to a community agency. You come to us, CPLEA, perhaps a friend, family member, Reddit, social media, ChatGPT or other AI tool, we're not judging here, TV, or perhaps another source altogether. So please specify. Give everyone maybe a couple more seconds, share their thoughts with us.
Okay, I'll count it down in five, four, three, two, one, and we're going to close that up. Thanks so much for responding to that. Gives us an idea of where everyone's looking for information. And I see by far, oh dear, I don't have my good glasses on. Legal support seems to be the highest, and then community, followed by
No, no,
CPLEA.
we're next. We're next, Jess.
We're glad to hear it. Thanks everyone for sharing that with us. Okay, Judy.
Okay, well, we're going to start here. Time for our first myth, Jess. So there's often a fuzzy public perception of what Canada's constitution actually is. So whether it's just one document, maybe the size of a placemat, something you put in your pocket. So what is it, Jess?
So Canada's constitution is not just one document. It's actually made up of three different things. So the first one is the Constitution Act 1867. So it's a piece of legislation from 1867. The second is the Constitution Act 1982. So we have another version of that act that came out in 1982. And then it also consists of unwritten rules and customs. So the Constitution Act 1867 created Canada as a nation separate from the United Kingdom. So that's when we think of Canada became a country in 1867. That's what we're thinking of. So it brought together the first provinces of Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. However, the United Kingdom Parliament still had authority to make major changes to our Constitution. But that changed in 1982. So the Constitution Act 1982 builds on the 1867 Act, and importantly, it allowed Canada, not the United Kingdom, to change its own constitution. And a document many of you are probably familiar with, the Constitution Act 1982 included the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or simply known as the Charter.
Okay, that this
Judy
is
has a
actually the size of a placemat, Jess, right here.
if you went to school, or I think we got it in like elementary or junior high, they often handed those out to students. So some of you may have one of those kicking around at home as well. And that's a copy of the charter. So you can read that there. We have the two acts, the Constitution Act of 1867 and the one of 1982. We also have unwritten rules and customs, and these are legal principles that are not explicitly included in the Constitution, in either Constitution Act, sorry, but they're still foundational to Canada as a country. So examples include democracy, or the rule of law, or judicial independence. So the concept that the judiciary or the court system is separate from government. So often when we talk about the constitutions, people might often be referring to the 1867 and the 1982 acts. But it's important to know that these unwritten laws and customs, unwritten rules and customs are still part of the Constitution and they apply as well. So there's many things that a constitution accomplishes. So for example, it creates the Parliament of Canada, including the Senate and the House of Commons. It creates provincial governments. It distributes powers between the federal and provincial governments, which we'll talk about in a minute. It also sets out rules for appointing some of the judges in our country. There's financial terms about revenues, taxes, assets, debts, at a national level, not at an individual level. It sets out rights of, there's a portion of it that talks about Indigenous peoples in Canada. There's an equalization formula and rules for minimizing regional disparities. So you may have heard about that in the news. And also sets out a process for amending the Constitution. So if there's appetite to actually change the Constitution, there's quite a rigorous process that has to be completed in order to do so. So who does the Constitution apply to? Well, it applies to governments in Canada, all governments in Canada. It sets out rules for how governments engage with the people within their jurisdiction. So for example, how a provincial government engages with the people within its province. And it includes protections for both citizens and non-citizens. And we're going to talk about this later on as well. So one key feature of the Constitution is that Canada is what we call a federal state. So this means that the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments, they share lawmaking responsibilities. And the Constitution says which level of government has jurisdiction over certain areas. And this is known as division of powers.
So whenever we give public presentations, I find that most people don't actually know much about our Constitution, unfortunately, and the fact that it is our supreme law. And Jessica, let's pull out our first exhibit here. This is an image of Mount Robson that I thought would be very fitting, which is the highest point of the Canadian Rockies, not located in Alberta, by the way, but in British Columbia. So I like to tell people, think of the Constitution as being at the very top of that mountain summit of all laws, and that sun shining at the very top there. It's a beautiful image, right? Looks a little surreal, I'd say.
It's not AI, we promise. We found it on the BC Parks website.
That's right. Someone took the time and effort to actually compose and take that shot in real life. So since we're talking about the Constitution already, Jess, let's switch gears and focus on the separation of powers in Canada and the powers of our Prime Minister in Canada. So much like our neighbors to the south, people may get the impression, maybe, that our country's elected leader, our Prime Minister, Mark Carney, has sweeping power. So to warm us up a little bit, let's pull up an exhibit here of one of the very early meetings between US President Donald Trump and also Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. I believe this was their second meeting together last spring, of course, at the height of the tension with all the tariff discussions. And you look at this first picture here, aren't they just the best of friends? There's just nothing awkward happening here at all, okay? And the next one, Oh, look, they're total bros in the second one. So can you guess which one is the headliner image for CBC and which one is CNN? So it's the same event, two very different vibes. So the first one, just for context here, is the CBC image. And the second one, we go back to that, Jessica, it's actually the CNN one. So talk about the differences in even cultural perceptions conveyed in Canadian versus American media sources about the exact same event, and also the perceptions of power. So Jess, does our Prime Minister Mark Carney have all the power in Canada?
So the reality is that our Constitution was designed to avoid just that, and that is one person holding too much power. So just like division of powers, where we see the separation of lawmaking responsibility between the federal government and the provincial governments, we have a separation of powers, and this is also a key feature of our Constitution. And there are the separation of powers refers to these three different branches of responsibility, each with its own powers. So the first is the legislative branch, and their responsibility is to make the law. So meaning it introduces, debates, and passes legislation. Federally, this is Parliament, which includes the House of Commons and the Senate, and provincially, this is the provincial legislatures. The next branch is the executive branch, and this branch implements the law, meaning it gives royal assent to bring the laws into force in Canada. And these are the laws, of course, passed by the legislative branch. So the executive branch includes the monarch's representatives in Canada, so the Governor General and the provincial lieutenant governors. It also includes the government leader, like the Prime Minister and the provincial premiers, and government cabinets. The third branch is the judicial branch, and that branch interprets the laws, meaning it gives further meaning to the words in legislation passed by the legislative branch. So this branch includes all the courts across the country, from courts within a province to the federal courts, and of course the Supreme Court of Canada. These three branches create an important system of checks and balances. So for example, the legislative branch makes the laws, but the judicial branch interprets them. So this means the courts can decide if a law is unconstitutional or goes against the Constitution. So here in Canada, the Prime Minister is part of the executive branch of government. So one of those three branches we just talked about. The legislative and judicial branches balance out the executive branch's power. So no one person has complete power in Canada. The rule of law is another important feature of our Constitution, but it's one of those unwritten rules and customs that we talked about earlier. So the rule of law limits government power. Governments have to follow the law just like everyone else. And because the judicial branch has separate powers from the executive and legislative branches, the courts can strike down government laws or decisions that go against the law.
So I just want to go back to the earlier point, Jess, that you made about the Constitution, including protections for both citizens and non-citizens. And let's have a little chat about whether everyone in Canada has the protection of these fundamental rights. And we often hear in the news about non-citizens being involved in our justice system. And this brings up some really interesting questions, like, are they still entitled to procedural rights under the law? And does the Charter only protect Canadians?
Great question. So, for the most part, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms applies to everyone who is physically present on Canadian soil, whether or not they are a citizen of Canada or regardless of their immigration status. So whether you're a tourist, temporary foreign worker, permanent resident, or even a refugee claimant who arrived yesterday, you are protected by a majority of the Charter's provisions. There are certain provisions that explicitly say that they only apply to citizens of Canada. And there's two kind of rights that flow from that, or two rights that only apply to citizens. And that's democratic rights. So to vote and run for office in Canada, public office, so to run, for example, to be a government official, you have to be a citizen. And the other one is mobility rights. So to move between provinces and work in any province. Those are two rights that are afforded to citizens or protected for citizens of Canada only. But even immigrants and visitors facing deportation for crimes in Canada have the protection of the Charter. So there was a case before the Supreme Court of Canada in 1985 called the Feng case, and it's a landmark case that decided that refugee claimants do have rights. So the government tried to argue that refugee claimants were protected by the charter, but the court disagreed, and they ruled that the word everyone, which is used in Section 7 of the Charter, which protects against life, liberty, and security of the person, it literally means everyone who is physically in Canada has the protection of these rights. So that means that if someone's arrested in Canada, they have the right to remain silent, retain a lawyer, be free from unreasonable search and seizure, and not to be arbitrarily detained. And those rights apply to everyone.
Mm. Thanks, Jess. And to really add on to Jess's point, I do want to highlight here the significance of our charter rights here in Canada. And it really helps to remember that not all legal systems work this way. So as Jess already mentioned, you can't be arbitrarily detained, right? You can't be jailed for a crime without due process. And you're also presumed innocent until proven guilty. And for people coming from other countries and legal cultures, that can be very surprising, we find, and also sometimes hard to trust. So for example, some countries like China convict 99.975% of defendants in criminal trials. And reversing a conviction is notoriously hard, if not virtually impossible. So let's just put this in focus with a real world example here. So Jessica, can you pull up our next exhibit? Okay, so our next exhibit here is of Chris Wu. So the credit image goes to Vogue here. And for context, this was his debut on the Burberry runway in its fall 2016 menswear show. And some of you may have heard of Chris, maybe not, but Chris Wu is a Chinese-Canadian rapper, actor, and former member of EXO. Fun fact, by the way, EXO was one of the pioneering K-pop groups before acts like BTS became global household names. And he grew up in Vancouver, BC, and later became a massive celebrity across Asia with hit albums, luxury fashion endorsements, and top movie roles. And then in 2021, everything suddenly stopped after police in China detained him over sex crime accusations. And within 24 hours of his detention, his online presence and music were all scrubbed from the Chinese internet. His legal process happened behind closed doors. After a long period of detention, I believe almost a year, he was convicted of sex crimes in 2022. Sentenced to 13 years in prison, then fined over $100 million separately for tax evasion, and will eventually be deported back to Canada. So from the outside, the process was very opaque. There was very little public information, no transparent trial or even appeal process, and almost no meaningful way for the public to understand how that outcome in this case was reached. And that's not to minimize the seriousness of the allegations, the convictions against him and his case, but it's just to highlight how different legal systems and cultures operate. And this is why we do what we do at CPLEA. We work with legal intermediaries and justice navigators who support people from many different backgrounds, including people whose lived experiences tell them that asserting their rights can be risky, pointless, or even outright dangerous. So when we say things like, oh, you have the right to remain silent, or you have the right to a lawyer, or you can't be arbitrarily detained, we know that for some people, that doesn't sound reassuring at all. It sounds very unfamiliar, especially when their understanding of law comes from places where legal culture looks very different from ours. And from our experience in the work we do, a sense of trust, emotional and psychological safety are all very important to people when interacting with our justice system.
I think, Judy, that is a great example too of just how different things are around the world, but also as a reminder that when we are traveling in another place or in another country, the rules of that country apply to us there, not the rules of where we've come from. So that's why when people come to Canada, the Charter can protect them in many ways, but when we go somewhere else, we are subject to the laws of that place as well.
Mm-hmm. So next one here, Jess. So one issue we often encounter in our public legal education work has to do with sources of law. The public is not always aware of sources of law in the legal system. And sometimes we encounter people who think that legislation is the only or main source of law. And it kind of goes a little bit something like this. Well, I couldn't find something in a particular act, so it's not law at all, right? Or is it, Jess?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when we're talking about sources of law, it's like where do we find all this law, right? Where do we find these legal rules that apply to us? And there are two sources of law in Canada. The first is legislation, and the second is common law. So legislation are the written laws that we find in acts and regulations that are passed and created by government. Common law, though, is the court's interpretation of legislation and laws passed down only through court decisions. So let's dive a little bit deeper into this. So first, as we said, acts are the written rules created, debated, and passed by a government. So this is the legislative branch we mentioned earlier. So they're also called statutes. Once an act passes, it's harder to change, right? All the changes have to be created, debated, and passed by the government. They have to go through that same rigorous process. Acts usually have the word act in their title. Some have the word code, which can get confusing. So examples of acts include Canada's Divorce Act or Canada's Criminal Code or Alberta's Consumer Protection Act and Alberta's Residential Tenancies Act. So these are all pieces of legislation that have been passed by a government, either the provincial government or the federal government, depending on which one has the authority given by the Constitution to pass those laws. Regulations are written rules that set out how an act functions. So they're more the nitty-gritty bits and pieces. So this means that all regulations are made under or belong to an act. So think of the act and you have the regulations underneath. Regulations are created by cabinet, which is of course part of the executive branch that we talked about earlier. And so they can become law through an order in council. Cabinet or government ministers can also change regulations quite easily. These aren't, created, debated, and passed through the legislature. They're just done by cabinet ministers. So regulations often address issues where changes happen more often. So if there's a certain standard or a fee for something or a fine for something, those are often included in the regulations underneath of an act. Regulations usually have the word regulation in their title. So examples of regulations include Alberta's Occupational Health and Safety Regulation, which of course is made under Alberta's Occupational Health and Safety Act. We also have Canada's Federal Child Support Guidelines, which is a regulation, even though it doesn't have that word in the title, but that is made under Canada's Divorce Act.
Jess, this reminds me, I'm having a brainwave right now. I have something in my cabinet that might help explain this visually to everyone.
Uh-oh, what do you have in your cabinet?
Bit of your laughter. Boy. All right. So I have a skeleton in my cabinet, and for the record, it's actually not my skeleton, but it just happened to show up in my cabinet one day. And honestly, I don't know what to do with it most of the time, but today it finally has a purpose. So what I like to tell people is to think of an act as the skeleton and the regulations as the muscles and ligaments, if you could imagine that for a moment, that make the skeleton move. I would even add that common law or case law, can't see it here, but you could all imagine, is the blood, tissue, and organs. So the brain, the heart, all the good stuff that keeps it alive and responsive to real situations. Also, you might notice that it's missing its left hand. I don't know why, but that's just how it came. So in case the skeleton hasn't been memorable enough for you today, we do have a YouTube playlist. It's very short, very digestible, that covers this topic. So, okay, Jess, moving on. I say a sub-myth that flows from all of this is that regulations aren't real laws. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, sometimes there is this perception because they aren't passed through the legislature, they're just made by cabinet ministers. But that is not true. Regulations are legal and enforceable just like acts. A person can be fined or face penalties for breaking a regulation just like they can for breaking an act. The only difference is that of course, Parliament or the provincial legislatures make the acts, while cabinet and government ministers make regulations.
So do we only need to look at the act and not its regulations then?
No, we have to look at them together. Together, they set out all the rules that apply on a topic. So if you don't look at the regulations, you might actually be missing out on on some very important rules. So for example, Let's take Alberta's Employment Standards Code, and that sets out minimum standards that apply to most employer-employee relationships. The Employment Standards Regulation sets out exclusions and exceptions to the standards that are in the code for certain workers or industries. So if you look only at the Act and not at the regulations, that can lead to an incorrect understanding of the law. So you need to look at them both together to get the full picture.
That's great. So Jess, can you tell us more about common law, and otherwise known as case law then?
Yeah, okay, so we've talked about the acts and regulations as one source of law. Let's talk about common law as the second source of law in Canada. So, common law is the court's interpretation of legislation and acts that have been passed down only through court decisions. So that's what we call it case law sometimes, or judge-made law. So, common law exists in the decisions by judges. It's not written in legislation. And there are two different types of common law as well. So, first, there's interpretations of legislation. So, where a law isn't clear or someone's challenging a law is unconstitutional, then the courts can review it and make a decision. The second type of common law is that there is legal principles that only exist in court decisions. So, there are some legal rules that don't exist in any type of act, and they have only been refined over time in different cases. And examples of this are contract law and tort law. So you're not going to find an act on contract law, but you will find important rules that apply to contracts in these judges' decisions that have been passed down for many years. And court decisions set a precedent for how courts should decide similar situations in the future. So a lower court must follow the precedents set by a higher court in the same province. And all courts in Canada must follow the precedent set by the Supreme Court of Canada. A precedent can change if a court believes there's a good reason to do so, such as a future case is slightly different from the previous case, or if societal norms have evolved over time. Sometimes the government will create legislation to what we say codify common law, which the courts then can interpret again. Other times they leave this law to the courts only. So common law can be tricky to understand and requires good legal research skills. Sometimes judges overturn older cases, meaning that older case is no longer good law. And we aren't suggesting you go out and start researching common law. This is a skill that is better left to legal professionals.
Okay, so here's another myth we sometimes hear about as well, is that common law isn't real law because it isn't written down.
Common law is very much real law. And it is written down. It's just not written down in legislation, but in court's decisions. And most court decisions are now freely available online. It used to be that they were only available in books, but now you can find them all online.
Through CanLE, I will add that point there.
Yeah.
And how about for folks who may be wondering, can judges just make up whatever law they want then?
No. And so judges must base their decisions on existing legal principles and what we just talked about, those precedents. So they can interpret or adapt the law, but they can't invent rules out of thin air. So except for decisions of the Supreme Court of Canada, a person involved in a case can appeal their decision to a higher court. And then a higher court would review the lower court's decision, interpret the law for themselves, and decide if the lower court made the correct decision. But of course, once we get to the Supreme Court of Canada, their decisions are final.
Okay, so does all of Canada follow common law then?
All provinces and territories except for Quebec follow the common law in Canada. So Quebec has a different system called civil law. And civil law relies mainly on written codes and statutes, not on judges' decisions.
All right, I feel like we probably have discussed sources of law now to death. So moving on, it's important to know where to go when it's time to go to court and also to file a claim. So Jess, how's this myth to tackle? All courts in Canada do the same thing.
Well, the reality is that different courts deal with different types of issues. So you can't just go to any court and start a lawsuit, again, about any topic. So we say that each court has its own jurisdiction and area of expertise. So for example, appeal courts can only review decisions from lower courts for legal mistakes. They don't retry the case, so they don't rehear all the evidence and make new decisions. We have three main courts in Alberta, and then the Supreme Court of Canada. So let's look at each of these. So the Alberta Court of Justice, used to be called Provincial Court, is the busiest court in the province and also the lowest court in the province. And we say that just lowest meaning only because there's then appeals that flow up from it. That's what we mean by lowest. So the provincial court handles the vast majority of legal issues that ordinary people would face. So they can deal with civil claims, so such as sometimes called small claims. So claims that are worth up to $100,000. So if you have a contract dispute or someone owes you money, for example, those can usually be dealt with in the Alberta Court of Justice. The criminal division of the Court of Justice handles the majority of criminal cases. So every criminal case starts here. Sometimes they do have to move on to the next level of court. But the criminal division in the Alberta Court of Justice does handle the majority of them. And there's also a family division. So it can deal with things like child support, spousal or partner support, parenting time, used to be called custody. For unmarried couples or for married couples who are separated but not yet divorced. So the Alberta Court of Justice can really handle, like we said, a lot of the issues that what we call everyday legal issues. The Court of King's Bench of Alberta is the next level of court, and it's called Alberta's Superior Court. So remember, every province across Canada has these three levels of court. We're going to talk about a provincial court, a superior court, and an appellate court. So the Court of King's Bench of Alberta handles serious criminal law and jury trials. It's the only court that can deal with a divorce. It handles wills and estates issues. So if there's an issue with someone's will, if your lawsuit is worth more than $100,000, so say someone owes you $200,000, then you would start that claim in the Court of King's Bench. And importantly, it also hears appeals from say many cases that come out of the Alberta Court of Justice. So if you have a decision from a judge in the Alberta Court of Justice, and you have a legal reason to appeal, and I say legal reason to appeal because you cannot appeal a judge's decision just because you don't like it. There are very strict rules about which cases can be appealed. But if you meet that threshold to be able to appeal your case, you would appeal it to the Court of King's Bench. So that court would then, like we said, review everything and decide if the Alberta Court of Justice decision or Alberta Court of Justice made the right decision. Okay, the third court in Alberta, the highest court in this province, is the Court of Appeal of Alberta, and that's called the Appellate Court. So there's only two locations, Edmonton and Calgary. It does not hear trials. It only hears appeals from the lower courts and corrects errors of laws in decisions. So cases are heard by 3 judges, and their decisions are binding in Alberta. Okay, we've talked a little bit about the Supreme Court of Canada as well. So the Supreme Court of Canada is located in Ottawa, and it is the appeal court for the entire country. So the Supreme Court of Canada only accepts appeals of cases that are of national importance. And once it makes a decision, that decision is binding on the entire country. So if you have an Alberta Court of Appeal decision that meets the threshold to ask for an appeal, you would file that appeal with the Supreme Court of Canada. And if you were in another province at their appeal court, you would file the appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada as well.
Okay, so really the Supreme Court of Canada is the ultimate boss court of all courts in Canada. And we had an artistic vision for the next exhibit here to really convey the gravity and importance of the Supreme Court of Canada. So in the interest of ruthless efficiency, we thought that maybe it would be a good use case for our team to see what AI could come up with. So Jessica, let's pull up our next exhibits here. So it took us a while with prompting to even get something remotely close to our artistic vision. As you can see, AI got very confused with what we were trying to do. And for context, I'll read out the prompt that we were using or some variation of it. Generate an image that is an allegorical representation of the Supreme Court of Canada, a triangle with imposing arms like Bowser from Super Mario Bros, posed like a final boss fight with dramatic lighting in the high Renaissance art style of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. Anyhow, yeah, we didn't quite meet our artistic vision that we had in mind, and we could probably all agree that we've seen enough of AI-generated sludge for one day. So this is what the Supreme Court of Canada actually looks like. So since we're talking about courts, Jess, so here in Alberta, like other provinces, we have specialized criminal justice courts. So for example, Indigenous court, mental health court, drug treatment court, domestic abuse court, and more recently here in Alberta, Calgary's new community court. Not everyone is familiar with what these courts do. And I'd say, unfortunately, sometimes there can be this misconception out there that specialized courts are quote unquote get out of jail free cards. What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, this is a big one. So, one of the goals of Canada's criminal justice system is rehabilitation, and that's to help offenders become productive members of society again. So, these specialized criminal courts try to address the underlying or systemic issues that may lead to people committing crimes. So, not everyone out there committing crimes is just, a bad person who has nothing better to do. Sometimes there are very real reasons why this keeps happening. So these courts operate differently than a usual criminal court. So they provide specialized supports to some people accused of crimes. So traditional criminal justice goals of denunciation and deterrence through punishment are not always effective, especially when crimes are committed out of desperation or for survival. So, for example, the Indigenous courts in Edmonton and Calgary integrate Indigenous legal traditions, which have existed in Indigenous communities for several hundred years, and they aim to decrease the overrepresentation of Indigenous offenders in the justice system by focusing on a restorative justice approach. To the crime, and they work through like peacemaking and connecting accused people, to their cultures and communities. And if we look the same at like the drug treatment court, again, it's for those who are committing crimes, maybe with a drug addiction. And so that court offers specialized supports, not just to, charge someone with a crime, but actually get them the support they need to overcome that addiction.
And to add on to Jess's point with the preventive and systemic law lens, keeping people in prison is expensive, and many offenders with mental health or drug issues unfortunately see jail time for just minor crimes. So specialized courts are designed to help offenders and their communities as well, to enforce ongoing requirements and accountability while avoiding overcrowding prisons and also providing the support that people need to really improve their lives. So if you're wondering what preventive law is, we do have a LawNow article on the topic. And we also have a recent contributor article on Calgary's new community court for those who want to learn more. So Jess, I feel like we're kind of getting to kind of like the last 20 minutes or so here. And Jess, we've both been steeped in this public legal education world for a while now. But I think one of the early misconceptions that we picked up way back in our baby lawyer days, I could certainly admit my own guilt with this one, before we saw the light at the end of the tunnel, was this idea that legal issues can be neatly categorized, right? So you spot all the issues, what I like to think of the Easter eggs or bunnies on a law exam or a situation with a client you're working with. You sort them into areas of law, apply the rules, analyze, and voila, you come up with a magical solution. Legal problems solved just like math problems. It sounds a little cringy, okay? But it probably made sense to us at the time. We were both BComs with econ brains and probably still are. But, we were very wrong.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice if, everything was just that simple? But the reality is that law regulates human lives, but human lives are messy, right? We have to have messy issues. And so while the law tries to categorize issues into different areas of law, like family law or tenancy law or criminal law, life is not this neat. And often someone's situation involves various legal issues across different areas. So, for example, someone getting a divorce may also be dealing with debt, criminal charges, losing their job. So There are a couple of folks that can help with these types of issues. So the first one is the justice navigators, who are non-lawyer professionals. They can help their clients understand what legal issues they're dealing with, and provide them information about that topic. So this might be a social worker or a teacher or a librarian. And there's also lawyers in our justice system, and lawyers can provide further help to clients to prioritize and evaluate each issue. And then, if the issue has to go to a court or some other type of hearing, then lawyers can help with that too. I do want to point out an important distinction. If you're looking for legal advice, so how the law applies to your situation, you're going to have to go to a lawyer for that. A justice navigator can't help you with that, but they can provide you with some very valuable legal information that may help you make decisions about your situation as well.
And one point I'd also like to add here is that people sometimes think that lawyers can solve every legal problem too, but that's not the case at all. So there's a distinction between different lawyers, areas of practice, and what they can and cannot do. So I like to say, think of this like a medical analogy with a range of health issues that you may have in your life. You don't see your family doctor if you're having a stroke. You go to the emergency room, okay? Likewise, a radiologist is not going to be able to solve your footwork problem for you. Okay, same with lawyers. You're not going to go to a real estate transaction lawyer if you're being sued for a debt matter and you need to attend a court hearing in like 2 weeks. Likewise, a divorce lawyer is not going to prepare a rental agreement for you, or they shouldn't be.
Yeah, it shouldn't be. Some lawyers do practice in different areas, so you might find some lawyers that, do family law and some civil law and whatnot. But for the most part, lawyers tend to have different areas that they specialize in. And this is why we at CPLEA do what we do. There are a variety of laws that apply to us in different situations. And so that's what public legal education is all about. And it's about making the laws available and understandable. And in our case, we work to make sure that Albertans have access to that information for free. And in easy to digest formats. So we try and create our information in what we call plain language, or ways that are more easy to understand. If you've ever read some of the acts and regulations that have been passed, they're not easy even for us to sometimes understand what they're saying. I often refer to them sometimes like Frankenstein legislation, because you have to look here, there, and everywhere to find what the rule actually is. So that's what we at CPLEA try to do, is try to break it down and make it easy to understand. So we have information available like we said at the beginning, in a variety of formats, and it's all free. So on our websites, we have videos, we have webinars, we have print resources, etc.
And speaking of making things easy to understand, Jess, should we do like a quick rapid fire style recap of what we put under the microscope today?
Sure.
Okay.
Go ahead. Kick us off.
Okay, you want me to do this? Okay.
Yeah.
So the Constitution consists of not just one document, as just mentioned, but the Constitution Act 1867, the Constitution Act 1982. And if you have a copy of that at home, you can see that it very much is the size of a placemat. Also, unwritten rules and customs. And also the point that I made, the Constitution is the supreme law in Canada. So think of that mountain peak. Think of that sun shining up there.
Okay, next one. The Prime Minister does not have all the power under our Constitution. Our Constitution was specifically designed to avoid one person holding too much power. Most charter rights apply to everyone, including permanent residents, temporary residents, visitors, and citizens.
And there are also two sources of law in Canada, legislation and common law. And legislation is a written laws found in acts, and regulations are created by a government. And common law is a court's interpretation of legislation and laws passed down only through court decisions. So if you need to remember this for whatever reason at some later point, just think of the skeleton analogy.
We also talked about how different courts deal with different types of issues.
With the Supreme Court of Canada being the ultimate boss court.
And finally, that there are specialized criminal courts that exist, but they are not get out of jail free cards. They are opportunities for people to actually rehabilitate and become productive members of society again.
Oh, yeah. And the last final point was that law regulates human lives, and human lives are often messy. So, yeah, not easily solvable all the time.
Exactly. And we say the law is really all around us. So if you think, oh, the law only happens, if I'm getting a divorce or if someone owes me money. Well, if you got in your car to drive somewhere today, there's laws that apply to that because you would have had to get, you have a driver's license, you have insurance, you have vehicle registration. So really, there are laws all around us. We engage with them every day in a lot of our activities throughout the day. We have posted a bunch of some resources in the chat. We've talked about some LawNow articles. Just for some context, LawNow is CPLEA's legal blog for non-lawyers, and it consists of articles written by volunteer contributors from across Canada. So we've highlighted a few of them in the chat that you might want to go check out for more information, including about the notwithstanding clause, preventive law, and Calgary's new community court. We've also shared the playlist we talked about of short videos on the Canadian legal system. So there's one on jurisdiction, acts and regulations, the rule of law, etc. So you can go check those out. They're really short, kind of fun animated videos. Finally, we encourage you to stay in touch with us. So you can visit our main website at cplea.ca, and you'll find links there to all of our different resources. We also invite you to subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter. So if you go to cplea.ca/subscribe, we'll send you an e-newsletter once a month and highlighting some of the, any changes in law or any new resources that we have. And we're also on social media, so follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X at CPLE Alberta. Finally, our next webinar is coming up in just a couple weeks on Wednesday, February 4th, and we'll be talking all about busting legal myths about your rights on the job. So always a catchy topic, what your employer can and cannot do and what you as an employee can and cannot do at work. So you can register for that one at cplea.ca/workshops. And I know there was a question as well about sending out materials. We won't be sending anything out, but we've recorded today's webinar, and that recording will be available probably in about a week. You could find that on our YouTube channel. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who's registered for today's webinar. So you'll get the links to the resources we've talked about, as well as to the recording to this webinar.
Well, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we hope to see you all again sometime soon, even if it's behind a screen.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.